In the late 1950s, deep inside a quiet research facility in Maryland, a scientist named John B. Calhoun was preparing to test an idea that many considered revolutionary and others considered deeply unsettling. It was an idea born from years of observing animals in the wild, studying how they lived, how they competed, how they moved, and how they survived. But what fascinated Calhoun more than anything wasn't how animals behaved in nature, but how they behaved when nature itself was removed from the equation. His question was simple, almost deceptively simple. What happens to a population when every threat is eliminated? No predators, no hunger, no disease, no struggle for resources, no competition for shelter. In other words, what happens if you create a perfect world, a world where every basic need is provided, every danger is removed, and every obstacle is smoothed out before it even appears? Most people would assume that such a world would lead to happiness, stability, and prosperity, a place where life could flourish without fear or suffering, a paradise. But Calhoun suspected something very different, something dark, something uncomfortable. He believed that stripping away the natural structure of struggle might not create paradise at all. It might create something worse, a slow collapse from the inside out. And so, Calhoun set out to build what he called an ideal world, not for humans, but for mice, a controlled environment perfectly engineered to eliminate the usual pressures that shape animal societies, a place with unlimited food and water, carefully maintained temperature, no predators, no diseases, and more than enough space for a thriving colony. He didn't know it then, but the experiment he was about to conduct would one day become one of the most controversial psychological studies in modern history. It would inspire debates in sociology, psychology, architecture, and even political theory, and it would be referenced for decades as a potential foreshadowing of what might happen to humanity itself. This is the story of the mouse utopia, the artificial paradise that promised perfection but delivered one of the most chilling warnings science has ever produced. Calhoun's early experiments began as simple population studies. In the wild, mouse populations grow and shrink depending on food availability, space, and predation. But Calhoun wanted to see what would happen if you removed all limitations. If a species is given everything it needs to thrive, how far will it go? So he built a small enclosure in the backyard of the Johns Hopkins Laboratory, a space about the size of a shed, surrounded by steel walls and protected from the outside world. Inside, he installed ramps, tunnels, nesting boxes, and platforms arranged like a miniature city. He stocked it with ample food and water, replenished daily. Then, he introduced a small group of mice and stepped back. At first, everything went exactly as expected. The mice thrived. They reproduced quickly. They settled into routines, built nests, groomed each other, and organized themselves into small social groups. For a time, the experiment looked like a gentle, peaceful version of nature. No visible stress, no hunger, no predators, no pressure. It seemed like the beginnings of true utopia. But Calhoun noticed something else, something subtle, barely visible at first, but undeniably present. Despite the abundant space available, mice began to cluster in specific areas. They weren't spreading out evenly. They were choosing to live close to one another, even when that meant crowding into the same corners and passageways. Calhoun's ideal world had more than enough room, yet the mice behaved as if space were already limited. What he didn't yet realize was that this pattern, this simple act of clustering, would later grow into something far more dangerous. As the population increased, social structures began to change. Young males began challenging older, dominant males. Mothers became more aggressive. Fights broke out more frequently. Calhoun saw wounded mice wandering aimlessly, unable to find a stable position in the group. But this was only the beginning. The real turning point came when Calhoun noticed a phenomenon he would later call the behavioral sink, a collapse of normal social behavior triggered not by real scarcity, but by the perception of crowding, by the psychological stress of living in a dense, highly populated environment. It wasn't the lack of resources that damaged the colony, it was the lack of meaning, structure, and territory. Calhoun began refining the design of his enclosures. He improved ventilation, increased the number of nesting boxes, and created multi-level environments. He wanted to eliminate every excuse, every flaw, every variable that might interfere with the experiment. Eventually, these early setups evolved into the famous Universe 25. But long before Universe 25, in these early trials, the pattern was already becoming obvious. Utopia, perfect abundance, was not leading to perfection. It was leading to collapse. The mice reached a point where the social structure broke down completely. Mothers abandoned their young, dominant males overstressed themselves, becoming hyper-aggressive or shutting down entirely. Some mice retreated into isolation, refusing to interact with others. Others developed repetitive, purposeless behaviors, grooming excessively, pacing in circles, or sleeping constantly. Calhoun realized that the problem was not physical environment, but behavioral environment. Mice were social creatures. They needed territory, hierarchy, and meaningful roles in their community. When those elements disappeared, when everything was handed to them without effort, something inside them began to unravel. The idea shocked him. A world without struggle might not create harmony. It might destroy it. So Calhoun decided to start over, but on a larger scale with more controlled conditions than ever before. His new goal was to create not just a comfortable environment, but a meticulously engineered utopia, something so perfect that no one could argue with its design. He believed that if the environment were flawless, the mice would have no reason to collapse, and if they still did, then the collapse would mean something far more profound. That decision led to the project that would define his career and shape scientific discussion for the next half-century. An enormous enclosure with walls of polished steel, carefully monitored temperature and humidity, and a feeding system that ensured unlimited access to food at all times. Nesting boxes were arranged in symmetrical patterns, like apartments in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Ramps and platforms connected everything like tiny highways. He gave it a name that sounded almost cosmic, almost biblical. Universe 25, the 25th attempt to create paradise. He introduced a small number of healthy mice to the enclosure and began recording everything: growth rates, territorial behavior, birth cycles, social interactions, injuries, and deaths. He filmed them, photographed them, and documented their lives with the precision of a surgeon and the curiosity of a historian. At first, the colony grew rapidly and peacefully. Phase A, the founding phase. Phase B, the exponential growth phase. Everything was calm, everything was predictable, everything looked perfect. But Calhoun was watching not the success, but the first cracks. Because he already knew the danger of Utopia was not in the beginning. The danger was in what came after. The moment when the population grew so large that mice lost something essential, not resources, but identity. And with that, the first signs of collapse began to appear.
By the time Universe 25 reached its middle stages, Calhoun realized he was observing something far more complex than simple population growth. The mice were entering what he called Phase C, the breakdown phase, and this stage would become the heart of his theory, the part of the experiment that still sends chills through psychologists and sociologists today. At first, the shift was subtle. Behavior changed one individual at a time, like cracks forming slowly across a sheet of ice. A young male losing his territory, a mother ignoring her pups for just a moment too long, a mouse grooming itself a little too frequently. None of it looked dramatic in isolation, but when Calhoun zoomed out, when he watched hours of footage, charted interactions, and compared patterns, the truth was unmistakable. The paradise he created was beginning to rot from the inside. The population had grown so large, so dense, that traditional mouse behavior, territorial boundaries, dominance hierarchies, maternal structure began to crumble. When too many mice competed for too few socially meaningful roles, the stress didn't spread evenly. It hit the weakest first. Young males who couldn't secure territory or social rank became outcasts, pushed to the margins of the enclosure. These loser males, as Calhoun called them, weren't physically denied access to resources. Food and water were abundant, nesting boxes were available, and no one prevented them from sleeping anywhere they wanted. But socially, they had no place, no purpose, no identity. Without a role, their behavior changed drastically. Some became hyper-aggressive, attacking other mice randomly, but not in the organized, ritualistic way dominance fights usually happen in nature. Others became passive, withdrawn, unresponsive. Calhoun described them as shells of mice. They stopped engaging in meaningful social interaction. They stopped defending themselves. They tolerated attacks without retaliation. They wandered, aimless, broken. Calhoun wrote, "These mice had no function, no place in society. They had lost the ability to perform even the simplest social duties." He called them the social dropouts. But they weren't the only ones showing signs of breakdown. Females began to experience a similar crisis. In Phase B, mothers were raising large litters with high success rates, but as the population densified, mothers became territorial and stressed. Nursing females fought other females. Some started abandoning their young altogether. Others displayed cannibalistic behavior, not because food was scarce, but because their psychological state had been disrupted by the constant presence of other mice. In a natural environment, a mother mouse raises her pups in a hidden nest with safe boundaries and minimal interference. But in Universe 25, nests were close together, and mothers frequently intruded on each other's space. Pups were attacked, displaced, or killed. Maternal care, one of the strongest instincts in mammals, began to fail. Calhoun noted that this was not a failure of resources. Every mother had access to more than enough food. This was a failure of behavioral stability. The more crowded the enclosure became, the more social norms collapsed. Then the population reached a critical threshold. Calhoun called it the behavioral sink. This was the moment the colony entered irreversible decline. The behavioral sink wasn't just overcrowding, it was something deeper, something psychological. When large numbers of mice clustered in the same areas, feeding stations, high traffic tunnels, nesting zones, social stress skyrocketed. Even though there was space available elsewhere, mice preferred to stay near others, creating artificial density that overwhelmed their natural social wiring. This confusion, abundance without meaningful structure, was the root of the sink. As the breakdown accelerated, the colony split into distinct behavioral groups. There were the aggressors, mice that constantly attacked others, not for territory or dominance, but seemingly out of frustration. They bit tails, tore fur, and picked fights with no purpose. There were the defenseless, passive mice who accepted abuse and withdrew from society. They hid in corners, stopped mating, and stopped grooming themselves. There were the abandoning mothers who stopped caring for their young, leading to extremely low survival rates. And then came the most famous group of all, the beautiful ones. These were mostly young male mice who withdrew completely from social life. They didn't fight, they didn't mate, they didn't explore, they didn't raise young. Instead, they devoted all their time to grooming, eating, and sleeping, living in upper-level platforms where they interacted with almost no one. Because they never fought, never mated, and never faced stress from raising pups, their bodies remained in perfect physical condition. Their fur was clean. Their appearance was immaculate. They looked flawless, sterile, empty. Calhoun called them beautiful, but the name was not a compliment. It was a warning. He wrote, "They are beautiful only because they have withdrawn from the world." These mice represented the ultimate failure of society, not chaos, but apathy. A generation with no desire for relationships, no interest in sex, no role to play, and no motivation to assert themselves in any way. This phenomenon horrified Calhoun more than the violence or the cannibalism. Violence was normal among animals. Apathy was not. A complete rejection of social life, reproduction, and responsibility was something that did not exist in nature. It only appeared when the environment was too perfect and too structured, removing all challenge and purpose. The beautiful ones weren't victims of scarcity. They were victims of meaninglessness. As time passed, the population hit its peak, but something strange happened. Instead of continuing to grow, it began to plateau. Birth rates plummeted. Female infertility increased. Females that did become pregnant often lost their litters. Adult males stopped seeking mates. Social bonds dissolved. Courtship rituals vanished. A society built for unlimited expansion had begun to self-terminate. This led to Phase D, the death phase. The colony began to shrink, not because of external threats, not because of predators, not because of disease, but because the mice had lost the behavioral tools required to function as a society. As Calhoun watched hours of film, documented patterns, and took notes, he realized something terrifying. Once the behavioral collapse began, it was irreversible, even if the population later decreased. The mice that grew up in the collapsed society during the behavioral sink never learned normal behavior. They never learned how to mate, how to raise young, how to defend territory, or how to form stable social groups. They reached adulthood physically healthy, but mentally unprepared for life. Calhoun summarized it with one sentence that would follow him for the rest of his career. They died in spirit before they died in body. Even when the population dropped low enough that resources were abundant and space was plentiful again, the colony did not recover. Normal behavior never returned. The beautiful ones remained detached. Mothers continued abandoning their young. Aggressors kept attacking without purpose. It was a society that had lost the ability to live. Calhoun made a chilling observation. Once a generation loses essential social skills, those skills can never be reintroduced. A society can reach a point where repair is no longer possible. The colony continued its downward spiral until the last mouse died. Universe 25, once a perfect world, became a graveyard. It was at this moment Calhoun realized the true weight of what he had created. He hadn't just built a mouse utopia. He had built a mirror, a warning, a prediction, a metaphor for what might happen to human societies under certain conditions. Too much comfort, too much structure, too little purpose. A world where challenges are removed, but meaning is not replaced. Calhoun believed that if humanity ever fell into a state where individuals no longer felt they had a meaningful role to play, no challenges to overcome, no responsibilities to shoulder, no purpose to strive for, the same behavioral sink could theoretically occur in humans. Not in the same form, not with the same behaviors, but with the same psychological roots. The collapse of meaning.
When Universe 25 entered its final months, Calhoun found himself walking through the silent hallways of a place that had once been filled with life, squeaking, fighting, mating, nursing, exploring. Now those same hallways felt like the ruins of a collapsed civilization. In the beginning, the sound was everywhere. The scurry of paws, the scratching inside nesting boxes, the squeals of pups, the territorial clicks of males as they warned each other to stay away. But now the air felt empty. The energy was gone. The life that once pulsed through the enclosure had withered into a quiet, almost peaceful void. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of extinction. Calhoun walked slowly, observing the last survivors. Many of them were beautiful ones, perfect fur, perfect posture, but hollow eyes. They were physically flawless, but emotionally vacant, uninterested in anything outside themselves. They groomed, they ate, they slept, and they waited. Not for danger, not for opportunity, but for nothing. They had no concept of tomorrow. Other survivors, aggressive males, abandoning mothers, apathetic juveniles, lingered in corners, performing repetitive, purposeless tasks. A male might climb the same ledge dozens of times, then stop mid-movement and stare into the distance. A female might carry bits of nesting material to the same spot for hours, even though she had no young and no nest. It wasn't madness. It was behavioral collapse. Calhoun documented every detail, knowing that no future generation of mice would ever live through this again. Universe 25 was not just an experiment, it was a story, a parable, a warning carved into biology itself. One day, as he watched the remaining mice move through motions that no longer mattered, he wrote in his journal, "The behavior of these mice is the living death. A death of social instincts, a death of purpose, a death of meaning." And this, Calhoun realized, was the heart of the collapse. The death of purpose. In nature, mice fight for food, territory, and mates. They raise young. They explore new spaces. Every action has meaning woven into their survival. But in Universe 25, survival required nothing. Food was limitless. Water was always flowing. Shelter needed no defense. There were no predators, no environmental threats, no challenges. Everything that once made life meaningful had been removed. Calhoun described this as the extinction of behavioral resilience. Without challenges, the mice lost the instinctual scaffolding that helped them develop social structure, discipline, aggression control, and parental care. Comfort became a sickness. Luxury became poison. It wasn't immediate. It took generations, and that's what terrified him most. The first generation lived normally because they had memories of struggle. The second generation lived differently. They had never known struggle, but their parents, who still acted normally. The third generation was raised by broken parents. The fourth generation was raised by no one. Each step, purpose dissolved a little more, until there was nothing left to pass on. The last generation. The final generation of Universe 25 was the one Calhoun feared most, not because they were dangerous or violent, but because they were benign, passive, emotionless, unconnected. These mice never experienced healthy reproduction, parental care, or social hierarchy. They never learned the rituals that define mouse society: courting, defending nests, forming groups, establishing dominance through controlled conflict. They knew only one thing: existence without meaning. Calhoun noticed something chilling. Not a single member of the final generation attempted to mate. Not one. Even when placed together, even when conditions were ideal, even when they were physically capable, none showed the slightest interest in reproduction. Calhoun realized the truth. Once purpose is lost for long enough, it cannot be restored. Behavioral extinction becomes biological extinction. The last mouse died quietly. No drama, no violence, just silence. Universe 25, once conceived as a utopia, had become a tomb. The interpretation. What did Universe 25 really teach? Calhoun never meant Universe 25 to be a prophecy. He was a scientist, not a doomsayer, but he knew his results resonated deeply with human society, especially in rapidly urbanizing, increasingly technological environments. And so he began to share his findings with psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, urban planners, doctors, and even government institutions. The message was always the same. Society collapses when meaningful roles disappear, not when resources run out, not when technology advances, not when population grows, but when individuals can no longer find purpose. He identified 4 critical elements necessary for a healthy society, what he called the 4 essential spaces. 1, the physical space, room to move, explore, and interact. 2, the social space, opportunities to form relationships, families, communities. 3, the role space, opportunities to contribute meaningfully, jobs, duties, responsibilities. 4, the spiritual, or mental space, a sense of identity, purpose, and belonging. Remove any one of these, and society weakens. Remove two, and society collapses. Remove three, and society dies. In Universe 25, all four were eventually compromised. Physical space became crowded. Social space became chaotic. Roles disappeared as the population became too dense. Mental space dissolved as mice lost the ability to form identity and purpose. Comfort didn't save them. Technology didn't save them. Abundance didn't save them. In the end, nothing could. The human connection. Calhoun insisted he was not claiming humans would follow the same path, but he believed the underlying principles applied to all social species, including ours. For humans, the behavioral sink might appear as social withdrawal, declining birth rates, family breakdown, increased anxiety and depression, lack of long-term goals, isolation in highly populated environments, a generation disengaged from relationships, challenge, and meaning. Not identical to the mice, but parallel in spirit. He asked a question that remains debated even today. Can a society survive if its members lose the will to create the next generation? In the decades after Universe 25, researchers debated the methods, the interpretations, and the relevance, but the symbolic power of the experiment only grew. Some viewed it as a warning about urbanization, others about technology, others about social alienation, others about comfort, others about meaning. But one interpretation became universal. A perfect world is not enough. A meaningful world is necessary. Calhoun's final message. Before his death, Calhoun summarized Universe 25 in one haunting statement, one that echoed far beyond the walls of the experiment. For a species to survive, it must not merely live. It must live with purpose. He believed that the true danger for humanity was not war, poverty, or famine, but the loss of meaning, structure, and identity in a world where survival is too easy and purpose too rare. Universe 25 was a paradise without purpose, and a paradise without purpose becomes a prison. As you reach the end of this story, imagine standing where Calhoun once stood, looking into a silent world that had everything, yet had lost everything. A world where abundance destroyed meaning. A world where comfort erased instinct. A society collapsed not from scarcity, but from emptiness. Universe 25 is gone, but the questions it raised remain. What gives a society meaning? What keeps individuals strong? What protects future generations? What happens when purpose disappears? And perhaps the most important question of all, could it happen to us?